So we're going to talk all about something we like to call hot hand theory, the clone theory of basketball. We're going to dive deep into it. We're going to unpack it here on part 2 of the pod. But first, I wanted to mention something. If you haven't seen part 1, we are going to be doing something huge for hot hand theory. We have a big announcement to make. We're going to be doing our first ever live stream this Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern. We will be on the Hot Hand Theory YouTube channel live to talk about basketball and talk about your questions and engage with everybody who's in the chat. But we are going to make sure that this is not going to be a regular live stream. This is going to be the beginning of a live stream series where we bring on the stream people from our comments who disagree with us or agree with us on any of our positions. It could be any fan, a fan of the Knicks or a fan of any NBA team across the league. And we're going to give that person a chance to share their view, really go deep into what their perspective is and why they either agree or disagree with us. And the series is going to be called Hot Fan Theory. And for our first one, we're going to be bringing on an Orlando Magic fan and talk about what Geoff and I, are getting wrong about Paolo Banchero. And we're going to be able to kind of unpack what our view is on Paolo Banchero as opposed to, anyone thinking that we don't think he's very good. We're going to talk about what we really think of Paolo and then kind of get from the Orlando Magic fans' perspective what they think we may be missing. So, Geoff, I think we're really excited about this. We think this is going to be a lot of fun. Any quick words you want to say about it before we dive into our clone theory conversation?
Yeah, we're really excited to learn about other teams. Of course, every person has their bias and their biases and their limitations. We watch a ton of NBA. I watch a ton of NBA. I've watched every Knicks game of the last 3 seasons multiple times because I do film for them. But with the way, my entertainment center is set up, multiple TV setup, I just love the NBA so much. I watch so much of other teams, but I can only watch so much, and so whenever I try to create a perspective, I try to maximize the amount of available information that I have to myself. I watch a ton of film. I look at all the data, but I'm also aware of the fact that it's an incomplete picture. And there are people who love specific teams and watch every game and have as much data as I do. And so we're really excited to bring people on of any fan base and be like, hey, you talked about the Rockets last week. We talked about Amen Thompson in the dunker spot or as a roller or as a pick and roll ball handler. Maybe you agreed with that and you thought we should have went a step further, or maybe you disagreed with it heavily and you have a good reason why. We're really, really interested to hear those perspectives, and we just want to open our minds even more and open our perspectives even more. And I want to emphasize something XJ emphasized in part 1. You do not need to have any platform. That is the main goal here. We're not trying to link up with someone with a huge following. We just want to get the perspectives of any fan who feels like their voice isn't being heard. We would love to talk to you. We would love to give you the opportunity to talk about your team. All you have to do is leave a comment on this video or any video. And if it's engaging and we we appreciate your perspective and we want to hear more of it, there's a chance we'll reach out to you and we'll have you on this Friday. Or as XJ said, the goal is to make this a part of a series. So, it could be in a future episode. So we hope you'll comment. We hope to hear from you.
Absolutely. Hope to hear from you. Please leave a comment and we'll respond. And if you're interested in coming on, we'd love to have you on. So diving deep into clone theory, we've talked about this at various times this year. This is kind of something we've created together, you and I, Geoff, as we've had these conversations and our typical theoretical, how do you build a team? What are the most efficient and effective ways to construct a high functioning team? And this kind of has come out of those conversations, and we really want to dive deeper into this in this episode. And I think any basketball lover will really enjoy this conversation, even if you vehemently disagree with what we're saying. And, again, if you really strongly agree or disagree, drop a comment below and let us know why you do. And we'd love to hear your feedback. But let's take a stab at kind of defining clone theory, and we can work through this, via conversation. But I did want to start there. At least for me, it's kind of the premise to me that in team building in the NBA, having a player who complements and enhances the skills of your star player can, and in most cases, is more beneficial to team success than having another sort of star level player who might bring more redundant skills and require higher usage. For example, maybe they're a primary on ball creator, and you have two of those guys where you could think of them as clones of one another. But instead, you could also have a guy who just brings additive skills, and those additive skills just emphasize the skills that your primary on ball creator has. And then also, they're able to like really shine as much as possible and show their skills and be the optimal version of themselves without taking away from that other player and while the other player taking away from them. And ideally, they would actually synergize and be able to create something that is a total that is more than the sum of its parts. So, Geoff, what do you think about that kind of premise or idea or concept of what we're talking about when we've talked about clone theory in the past, or how would you change or elaborate on that?
I think you did a perfect job of explaining it. We're very much hand in hand with how we see it. For those who don't know, if you missed the episode, this all started when we were talking about what the optimal team builds are. And I think XJ and I agree that the most ideal team build is getting two all NBA level players who have almost perfect synergy. Think of the Nuggets. Jamal Murray might not be an all NBA level player, but he's a very, very, very good on ball point guard who has the shooting to play off of Jokic, has the off ball movement to play off of Jokic. Just everybody's watched Nuggets games. You know about the connective synergy that the two of them have. And then Murray also gives you something defensively. Is he an all NBA level defender? No, he's not, but he's not a bad defender. He's helping the team on that side of the basketball. And so XJ's question at the time was, okay, if that's the best team, that's really hard to do. It's rare to find two players who are perfectly synergistic at that level because most really good players are kind of similar. Most of the really good players like to have the ball in their hands, are best with the ball in their hands. Their value is hurt if the ball is taken out of their hands. And so XJ's question at the time was, what is actually better? Is a better team one of those really good players, and then he's just surrounded by additive pieces? By the way, I'm pretty sure we coined additive. I don't think I've ever seen that anywhere, and I think it's just fucking awesome. Like, it's just it perfectly encapsulates what we're trying to explain here. But I digress. So, what would be better? One high-level All-NBA player surrounded by additive role players, or two of them, and they're kind of a messy fit and almost diminishing. We don't claim to know the answer, but I think there is an assumption in most NBA media that if you can just get two stars, you throw them together and you don't, consequences be damned, anything else be damned. And I think the main gist of clone theory is that actually, if the sum of its parts is greater, if the whole is less than the sum of its parts to enough of a degree, you'd actually rather just have the role player because you're losing so much if you add that second high usage star.
Yeah, that's really well explained. And I think a big part of this to me is the concept of sacrificing. So we often hear this when a team gets together, like a big three or two superstar players, or oftentimes it's like in the context of a big three, I think. And they're always saying like one of these guys has to sacrifice, one of these guys has to take a back seat with regard to their usage or with regard to their role on the team in terms of like they're not going to have the ball as much, they're not going to be able to create as much, and that's what they're used to doing. So they're going to have to sacrifice. And to me, I have heard that, and it's kind of framed as though like that individual player is making a sacrifice, but I also think it hurts the team for that player to sacrifice, to bring players in who need to sacrifice, which sacrifice to me essentially means be a lesser version of yourself. Now, why would I want a superstar level player or star level player to come onto my team and be a lesser version of themselves. And knowingly, like I'm walking eyes wide open and saying, this guy is going to be a lesser version of himself. And that's what we want. It's like, no, I want a guy who's going to come on and be the maximal version of themselves and not have a player who's going to have to sacrifice to really be able to be who, we want them to be and to be able to have the impact that they can have. And it's one thing to sacrifice in one space. So it could be like, this player is going to sacrifice their on-ball creation. Now they have to make it up somewhere else. So they have to either make it up with off-ball movement. They have to make it up with shot making and finishing. They have to make it up with, their willingness to set screens and do other things and do kind of some of that dirty work, and not just do those things, but do those things at a high level such that another player whose primary skill and ability is to do those things, they would do it better, right? And not only that, there's also the other end, which is defense. So now if you're sacrificing on-ball creation, can you make it up through your impact with off-ball defense, with on-ball defense, with rim protection, with secondary rim protection? Can you do some of these other things that are really important to winning basketball games at such a high level to where you're still conveying the same impact and level of value that you would have were you playing this on-ball creator role that you're used to? Can you still do that with those other types of tasks and responsibilities on the basketball court? And in most cases, those star players are not able to do that because they're star players because of their on-ball creation, their ability to break down a defense and score with the ball in their hands and create for others. And if they're not able to do that, then they're not going to be conveying as much value as they would were they in that role. And so why would I get a player who is kind of being a lesser version of themselves when I can get a player who's the maximum version of themselves? And not to mention, they would also, those other players who are being the maximum version of themselves, but don't bring those kind of on-ball majestic skills, they're going to be getting paid less because we view this typically in the NBA world as those on-ball creation skills are the most sought after skills. And so those guys get paid the most money, and that's why they're viewed as stars and superstars. So to me, it's really about players having to sacrifice being a bad thing for the team in most cases. And I think that ties into this.
I think a really interesting place to start, and I mean, we could just talk about this forever because I'm probably a little bit more neutral, or not neutral because it's our concept, but I don't think I'm as far into the idea that just two diminishing stars are always going to be worse than you are. Actually, I don't want to speak for you, but I can think of some examples on my head, on the top of my head, where maybe you would be like, yeah, it would just be better if the best player in this scenario, like Luka and Kyrie, for example, but that's not where I want to start. I want to start with the Phoenix Suns. They're super interesting to me because let's flash back to 2020, 2021. They win 54 games. They make the NBA Finals. And then they run it back the next season and they win 64 games. And they lose in 7 games in the second round to Luka. I think we can talk for hours about how Luka basically broke the perfect team build because they had almost exactly what you were describing in terms of a group of guys where nobody had to sacrifice. You could argue that Chris Paul and Devin Booker weren't the most natural fit, but I think this is the middle ground that I want to leave open because I do think it's possible that even though Devin Booker and Chris Paul weren't the cleanest fit, that they did add enough off of one another to make up for their slightly diminishing effect. And then off of them, you had Mikal Bridges, you had Jay Crowder, you had Cameron Johnson, you had DeAndre Ayton, who was basically playing the role of super role player back then. He was protecting the rim, he was rebounding, he was scoring efficiently. This was almost a perfect team construction back then. And they gave it all up to get that second superstar. And not only did they get a second superstar, they got, aside from Steph Curry, arguably the most additive superstar in NBA history in Kevin Durant. Because Kevin Durant's shooting, in theory, makes him, and he's an elite defender, he's an elite switchable defender, even in his old age, who can protect the rim and can slide with wings on the perimeter. he is somebody who can slide in next to almost any superstar and at least tread water. And look at what's happened. Look at what has happened to the Phoenix Suns. They went from a team with tons of picks and decent flexibility and a really high ceiling already. Again, NBA Finals berth and then a 64-win season. They went from that to fighting for their lives to be in the play-in. And look, I mean, they could make a run this season. I'm not saying they can't. I think the West is a lot more open than the East is. But I don't know about you, actually. I don't love where they're at right now compared to where they were. If I was a Suns fan, I would want to go back to 2021 and that future looked awfully bright back then.
Yeah. So your point, Chris Paul, Devin Booker, Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, DeAndre Ayton, and even throw in there Jay Crowder as an important piece at that time, especially in terms of his wing defense. I mean, that's an awesome place to build from, honestly. And I think you could argue, maybe you could replace DeAndre Ayton with like a better 5, potentially a better rim protector, at some stage. But there's not that much you need to do to upgrade that team. I mean, I think Chris Paul didn't shoot that well from 3 that season, which makes him a little less effective as an off-ball player, working off of Devin Booker. But Devin Booker is very malleable, and I think Booker is totally fine being off the ball. And, even that season, let's see, Booker had a 21% assist percentage, and Chris Paul had a 43.4 assist percentage that season. So clearly the roles were very clear. Booker, more of a secondary creator. Chris Paul is the guy who's kind of on the ball making the decisions. So yeah, I agree with you. I think the only issue there is that Chris Paul was Chris Paul was older at the time already. He was already, 36 or whatever the case may be. He was still good the year after and has been good in moments, when he's played for the Warriors. But I think he clearly was starting to slow down a little bit. So the only difference there is like, could I get a better version of Chris Paul, which is hard to imagine. Essentially only like a younger Chris Paul is probably a better version of Chris Paul. Or, could I upgrade my rim protector? So you could have those same roles, but just figure out where you can make improvements, in the margins. Maybe Mikal Bridges gets a little better in terms of in that specific role as opposed to the role that he's in now in Brooklyn, where he's the primary guy. Maybe Cam Johnson gets better, but I think that team construction was awesome, just like you said. And yeah, I think I would prefer that roster than the one that they currently have. And I think that would be counterintuitive to most NBA kind of people who watch the league, even at a deep level. I think that would be counterintuitive. So I agree.
And I think what emphasizes our point even stronger, look at Bradley Beal this season. Has he even been one of the 4 most impactful players? Not in a volume, like just per minute. I think you could argue that both Nurkic and Grayson Allen have been more impactful for the Suns this season.
I would argue that for sure. Yeah.
Which is what the point of clone theory is. Like nobody, if you were to redraft the NBA, would take, Bradley Beal over Grayson Allen, would take Grayson Allen or Yusuf Nurkic over Bradley Beal on most team constructions. But if you're sticking him in a place where he's the 3rd highest usage player, you're not getting near the best of Bradley Beal. In fact, Bradley Beal has been treading water this season because he's been way better on defense than he's ever been in his entire life. But his offense has been neutered completely because roles are more important than they've ever been, because the depth of skill across the NBA is as vast as it's ever been.
Yeah. So to add to that point real quick before you go forward. So Bradley Beal, to your point about his defense, he's essentially trying to do the sacrifice thing. I'm going to sacrifice my on-ball creation. I'm going to make it up on the defensive end. And he's been able to do it to an extent, but not to an extent that he'd be better than somebody else who was just better at that thing. Right. So that's just to add to your point there.
Right. Like they just picked up Royce O'Neal. And I don't think Royce O'Neal's better than Bradley Beal, but imagine a world where they used whatever they gave up to get Bradley Beal, whatever assets they had to give up, and got something else that was more fitting and just had Royce O'Neal in the Bradley Beal role. That's a way better team. And this is the point. This is what we're talking about when you say the sum of its parts is, or the whole is less than the sum of its parts. This is exactly that. If you were looking at NBA 2K ratings, Suns would be the best, one of the best teams in the league. But that's not how basketball works anymore because synergy is so important. And Nurkic, they're getting elite production from Nurkic and Grayson Allen as role players. They have two stars in Devin Booker and Kevin Durant. And this isn't a Clippers situation, a modern Clippers situation, or excuse me, this season Clippers situation where, like, when healthy for the most part, they've been really good. These Suns have just been pretty average no matter what the paradigm. And that's in spite of Durant and Booker. I mean, NBA.com just put out their MVP ladder. They have both Durant and Booker in their top 10 again. They have two top 10 MVP level players. They have two high level role players in Nurkic and Grayson Allen. And the whole is just so much less than the sum of its parts because team synergy is as important as it's ever been.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. So you need, if we're analyzing the NBA objectively, we need something to explain that. We need something to explain the fact that this team has two players who are considered top 10, potentially top 10 MVP candidates. So they have two of the 10 best players in the entire NBA. There's 30 teams. They have two of the 10 of them. Then they have two role players who are probably the best at each of their, or one of the best at each of their individual roles. Nurkic, in terms of his rim protection that he offers, his ability to rebound the ball on both ends. He's a 94th percentile offensive rebounder, a 99th percentile defensive rebounder. He protects the paint. He protects the rim. He can finish on the interior when he gets open shots, and he does all the dirty work on that end. And then we have Grayson Allen, who is the best 3-point shooter in the entire NBA. The guy is shooting 47% from 3-point range, which is 97th percentile in the NBA, and that's coming on 6 threes per 75, attempted. So, and also his true shooting is completely ridiculous because most of what he does is shoot threes, and he shoots them at an incredibly high rate. His true shooting is at 69% this year. That's 97th percentile in the entire NBA, and at his position, I'm sure is probably tops. So we're talking about we have two MVP level players, top 10 players in the entire NBA, and two of the best role players in the entire league. And the Phoenix Suns are where they are. You have to have something that explains, you have to have something about your worldview or your analysis that explains how that's able to happen. And clone theory does help to explain that. And that doesn't mean it's like right, but it is helpful to know that this kind of perspective is reflective of what we actually see in reality when we come onto the court.
Yeah. And I mean, I just want to, Kevin Durant, holy shit. Like, dude, he is in the 98th percentile in efficiency at the rim, 94th percentile in efficiency in the mid range, and 94th percentile in efficiency from three.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous
to do this at his age. And then to have Devin Booker, who EPM says is almost 50% more impactful as an offensive player than the guy I just was filleting in Kevin Durant. Like, dude, these two guys are amazing. Like, it actually shouldn't be hard to build a top 4 team around these two guys playing at this level. Durant's played 67 of 74 games. This isn't an injury thing. Booker's played 60 of 74 games. These two have played a huge percentage of the season together, and they've gotten elite role player impact from Allen and Nurkic, and now Royce O'Neal too, who's been good since he's been in Phoenix and really helpful. The Bradley Beal thing it's always been a wrench because they haven't been able to figure out how to come close to maximizing him. So it's not saying that Bradley Beal is a negative player, but the idea of clone theory is saying that Bradley Beal in this role as the third option he's just not helping them right now. He can't be. He almost can't be helping them for the results to be this mediocre.
Yeah, and just to support that really quick, Kevin Durant's on-off in terms of his differential from how the team performs with him on the court versus with him off the court is a plus 4.1 per 100 possessions. Devin Booker is a plus 6.4 per 100 possessions. Bradley Beal is a minus 1.5 per 100 possessions. So that doesn't tell the whole story, but it does say that when Bradley Beal's on the court, and I know he probably plays with bench units a little bit more than the other two do. When he's on the court, they are not succeeding at the rate that they are when the other two players are on the court. And that is seen both on the offense and defensive ends. Another team Oh yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say, start to carry this over to the rest of the league. This is why, as fans, we shouldn't be as moved when player X goes down in a non-optimal team build and the team doesn't miss a beat. That's not saying as much about the players as people seem to imply that they do. Oh, the Pelicans lost Brandon Ingram and the Pelicans have still treaded water without Ingram. That must mean Ingram's bad. No, it doesn't mean Ingram's bad. It means that they're replacing what Ingram was doing with just more Zion Williamson. It's when you already have that and your top two players have diminishing skill sets, when one goes down, it's really not hard to just replace the lost production because you're just increasing the usage. You're letting the other guy who's not injured more easily approach his optimal or his maximum production. Whereas when they're together, all you're saying is that you're not getting the maximum from either player. Like you're basically choosing, should I get 75% from two players or 100% from one player and then 100% from whoever is replacing him? Like now all of a sudden Trey Murphy is being maximized. Trey Murphy was struggling off the bench before Brandon Ingram was hurt. But Trey Murphy, who's an elite shooter, good defender, and has improved, as we covered a few episodes ago, off the bounce. Now all of a sudden, he's the guy next to Zion. Now all of a sudden, you're getting 100% out of Trey Murphy. Jesus, forgot his name for a second. Herb Jones, you're getting 100% from him because he's already a really good role player. CJ McCollum, who was kind of the third option with both Ingram and Zion Williamson, is now the most natural second banana you can have because he's a good shooter. He likes to move off the ball. But, you're not going to have Zion Williamson play point forward for 100% of possessions a game. You need someone to initiate the offense sometimes. Now that's fully CJ McCollum's job in those lineups. Everything kind of locks into place. And you look across the league, there are all sorts of clone theory examples. The Pelicans aren't the only one. The Timberwolves without Towns, the Knicks without Julius Randle, you go down the list. Clone theory exists everywhere because the truth of the matter is, and I don't mean to toot our own horn here, we're kind of the first to realize that team building is super far from optimized right now across the NBA. Really only the Nuggets and Celtics have figured out, and wouldn't you know it, they're by far the two best teams in the NBA. What do you know when you have starting lineups where everybody is at 100% of themselves? You're probably going to be a really fucking good team.
Yeah, I loved how you explained that. And I loved what you said about kind of when you're losing a player and then it's pretty easy to replace their impact because you're just letting the guy who's left, the one who's not injured, approach their maximal impact, which they weren't at before. I think that that's so spot on. And instead of getting diminished impact from two players, you're just getting 100% from one and 100% for the player who's replacing them. So I thought those were really amazingly illustrated points. And I think that in your example of what you said, there are multiple quote unquote clone teams throughout the NBA. It's really important to remember that in these situations, the team is not like replacing that player who's injured or who's out with another player who's making some, anywhere near what that player is making. They're just backfilling with what they have. They're just backfilling. It's not like, oh, we lost Towns. Let's get a guy who, is a better additive player than Towns, but actually is so good that he makes anywhere near the amount that Towns makes. They're just saying, hey, we're pulling the guys that we have here off the bench and they're just playing more. That doesn't really, again, you have to have something to explain this. We would expect the team to get much worse since their total talent pool drops precipitously when you just remove those players from the lineup. And somehow they're not. And so there needs to be an explanation for that. So you mentioned the Pelicans, you mentioned the Timberwolves. We've talked a lot about the Cavs, and the Hawks are one that I wanted to mention, which the Hawks lost Trae Young on February 23rd. Trae Young, obviously one of the most impactful offensive players in the game over the last, 5 to 7 years. Like, that's undoubtedly true. And almost certainly the most impactful player on the Hawks. I don't know who you would argue whether, him against. I think he's clearly the most impactful player on the Hawks. In the game since Trae has been out, the Hawks have a plus 2.1 net differential. In the games prior to Trae's injury, the Hawks had a minus 2.0 net differential. That's losing a lot of talent when I'm talking about losing Trae Young to somehow get 4 points better over a month's worth of games. And let's
emphasize this. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're not
No, go ahead.
saying that Trae Young is a negative player. That's not the point here.
Right.
This
Exactly.
would have happened if DeJounte Murray got hurt and Trae Young was the one. The point isn't about the players themselves. It's about the team builds. And you made such a good point. They're doing this. They don't even get to replace Trae Young's dollar amounts with any anything that could approach the sum of his salary thing. Like, imagine if this is just the Hawks minus Trae Young. Now imagine if somebody in the Hawks front office was like, holy shit, how about this clone theory? Let's replace Trae Young's dollar amount with 3 additive pieces. Then what would they be? What if they traded Trae Young or DeJounte Murray for 3 super good role players that they could probably get for them? Now you've got this Hawks team with DeJounte Murray playing the best version of himself, surrounded by even more depth of shooting and defense. And do you see where we're going with this, folks?
I now that you say that, I feel like I want you to talk about your favorite trade in the NBA. The one that the Los Angeles Lakers made.
Dude, the reverse clone theory trade.
The reverse clone theory trade. I
They
just wanted to give you
they would have won at least another championship.
The soapbox to talk about that one really quickly.
Thanks, man. Yeah, the Lakers traded Caruso and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and Kuzma.
Well, real quick, they didn't trade Caruso, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Caruso was a
they
casualty.
lost Caruso. They lost Caruso, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and Kuzma because of the KCP and Kuzma trade for Russell Westbrook. It's the worst trade in NBA history. You can't convince me otherwise. It's like the most damaging trade in NBA history. And like, this is the thing. Like, Russell Westbrook, honestly, if you think about it, is probably the poster of the clone theory, because like he was in that tier. And he was very much on the fringe of the tier, because Russell Westbrook, as absolute best, was an elite player. Like, everyone knows this. I'm not saying anything new. But was he quite elite enough to be the best player on a championship team? I'm not 100% sure. He could have been. He would have been, because of his lack of shooting, he probably would have been a little bit tougher to build around. But I think you could have built an elite championship team.
I think he could have been OKC. Yeah. At some of his peak days in OKC, if you put the right components around him, I think so.
And like, him and Kevin Durant, while not the most natural fit, were so good. And Kevin Durant's shooting, you probably like, the OKC didn't do them many favors. I mean, Ibaka was a great rim protector for them. All they needed was a couple wings, a couple 3-and-D wings. Just find any of them, like they were struggling with like Cephalosha and Andre Roberson, and just all they needed was one 3-and-D guy. But I digress. I mean, the point is that Westbrook, if you take him from being the guy like he was in OKC and put him in any situation where he no longer is the guy, all of a sudden he goes from 100% of himself to like 20% of himself, because so much of his impact is sewed up in what he can do with the ball in his hands. When the ball isn't in his hands as consistently, his impact just dissipates. It's just gone. And so he's not, people think it's like NBA 2K. It's like, oh, we just put Russell Westbrook in the mix. It's going to be great. And it's like, no, it doesn't work like that. And it especially doesn't work like that anymore. Maybe it worked that way 10, 15, definitely worked that way 30 years ago, where you could just throw talent together and, offense was just basically a series of one-on-ones. But it's not that anymore. Shooting and spacing and synergy, these are things that are as important as ever. And to bring it back to the Hawks, we're not saying that either Trae Young or DeJounte Murray are negative players. We're saying that they're such a bad fit together that it would just be way better to replace one of them with, and try to do the Moneyball thing, get an accumulation of their whole through more additive pieces. The compounding effect it would have on team success would be massive. At least that's our theory. And, I'm kind of worried for like Knicks fans that like, they're like, oh my God, we're getting MVP Jalen Brunson. Imagine if you add Julius Randle back to the mix. And it's like, well, maybe they're getting MVP Jalen Brunson because Julius Randle isn't there. Like, it's just not going to work that way. You're not just going to reintroduce Julius Randle and his usage, and it's not just going to be seamless. You're not going to keep getting MVP Jalen Brunson. One of two things is going to happen. Jalen Brunson is going to sacrifice, and Julius Randle will go back to being a very good player, but Jalen Brunson won't play at the MVP level he's playing at now. Or Jalen Brunson will keep playing at the MVP level he's playing at now, and people will be like, oh my God, Ewing theory, Julius Randle isn't actually that good. And that one of those two conversations is going to happen when Julius Randle comes back. I can almost guarantee it.
100%. And I think it, again, talking about explanatory power, clone theory kind of explains this in a way that it's not Ewing theory. It doesn't mean that Randall's not good or anything like that. Or it just means that bringing Randall back actually diminishes how well Brunson is able to maximize all of his abilities. And that would just be true even if there was not Randall, with a player like in terms of his stylistic abilities would be similar. So it's not really a reflection on Randall. And I'm glad that you mentioned that when we're talking about Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. It's not a reflection on Trae Young not really being that good or being a fraud or anything like that. That's not what we're saying here. It's just about how important fit is at this stage in terms of team building. And I love that you brought up the point of, maybe back in the day, it would be fine to just put talent together because NBA was more like a series of one-on-ones where teams were, there wasn't a bunch of help defense. And it's just like, yeah, can you break your guy down off the dribble and score? Then maybe if you had 5 guys who all did that at elite level, you would be unstoppable. But that's not what we see in the modern NBA. And so it's just a different environment.
Dude, there were Knicks fans. I'm sorry. I'm dumping on Knicks, but there were Knicks fans before the OG Anunoby trade who were coming up with trade packages of like Quickly and Grimes for Brandon Ingram. And they wanted the starting lineup to be Brunson, Ingram, RJ, Randall, and a center.
Yeah.
And I was just like,
funny.
this was before we had come up with like the clone theory or anything. But I, of course, me and you think about basketball similarly. So it was like, I had the idea in my head, like, I didn't know what to call it, but I knew about synergy and like I felt that way strongly. And it's like, you're trading two of the most the two most additive role players on the team, the most synergistic pieces you have, for just another redundancy. That would have been like just such a shit show. And I know that there are fans everywhere across multiple fan bases, or not multiple, all the fan bases, who probably still want to construct teams this way. And our hope is that we can kind of open the minds of, any fan base, and just conversations can be more catered towards, okay, is this optimizing synergy, or is it just trying to throw diminishing skill sets together that are going to end up being less than the sum of its parts?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And it's not, and like you said, it's not about Knicks fans or any fan bases in particular. In fact, like the way we're talking about it, this is clearly not the traditional or common way to look at team building. It's a different way to look at team building. And I think, it's fair, and it's kind of counterintuitive, because you would expect, hey, let's just put together the best players, and those guys would be too hard to stop, because how do you load up on, player X when you also have player Y there, and those guys are both MVP level players? There's nothing you can do. Like, that is totally intuitive and makes a ton of sense. So I don't begrudge any fans for thinking about the game in that way. We're just kind of asking you to look at it in this way and try to think through things from this kind of paradigm as you analyze the game. So that's kind of what this conversation was all about. And yeah, I think it was really good. And we kind of got to lay out our perspectives here. Any last thoughts that you want to have before we close out?
I just wanted to turn it to you, and I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here, because I think you underrate your mind in this way. Are there any clone two-part question? Are there any clone theory situations right now that you're surprised are working? Because I have one there. And then, are there any clone situations that you think are doomed and you expect them to go in a certain direction soon, or you hope they go in a certain direction soon?
Ones that are working, you mean like a team that is building, counter to the way that we're describing team building, but being successful at it?
Correct.
Off the top of my head, I wouldn't say it's working, and this is definitely not an example. This is something I mentioned to you recently. The Bulls have not been like better since they've lost Zach LaVine, which we would kind of assume that LaVine and DeRozan are sort of fall into this category, and they've lost LaVine. Excuse me. They lost LaVine, and they haven't really benefited from it at all. So we might have assumed that, but there are other reasons we can talk about.
Right?
What's that?
They haven't been hurt either, though, right? And I think people would. I think
they haven't been hurt either. Exactly. Yeah.
I think more traditional team build fans would assume they'd be more hurt than they've been.
And the one thing I would say is, like, if we're, and I don't know if you intend to go this way, if we're going to bring up Dallas, I would say that I just think that Kyrie is a lot more of an additive player than he has gotten as a reputation throughout his career.
Isn't that, yeah, that's where I wanted to go, is to Dallas. And I just think that's so interesting because I think, I mean, even if that's true, I think you'd agree that Kyrie does come off as someone who wouldn't be an additive piece. He doesn't have the highest defensive reputation. He is a good shooter, but he definitely is, like, I mean, maybe it's just because of all the videos, but you definitely see him as someone who, like, likes to dance, loves the ball in his hands. He's so crafty with the ball in his hands. You just wouldn't picture him as someone who could fill in next to a high usage superstar, especially one as Luka. But I got to be honest, like, I have to hold myself a little accountable here too. This is where I want to go with this, because we say it all the time. We don't like being wrong, but we're definitely open to being wrong all the time. I have to give credit to Luka. Like, I came on here start of the season and I talked about how heliocentric he is, how hard it is to win with one super heliocentric star because of the way they diminish potential co-stars. I think Luka's done a good job of not only embracing Kyrie in a way he never did with Kristaps, but of elevating him as a player. And I think Luka's played a hand in helping Kyrie be close to the best version of himself. I don't know what you think about that.
I think that might be true. I'm not comfortable kind of asserting that, so I'm not going to push too hard back against you, but I'm also not going to say, like, I think that that's definitely the case. Like, it could be. I just looking at his raw kind of data, Luka's usage and his assist percentage, kind of maybe we combine those two to get a sense of his overall offensive load, is pretty similar to how it's been throughout his entire career. So I think he's still kind of carrying that same level of responsibility for the offense, and not necessarily, I mean, definitely shooting threes at a little bit higher of a clip in terms of the amount that he's shooting off the catch as opposed to on pull-ups, but still shooting an absurd number of pull-ups. So to me, I give the credit more to Kyrie if I was to choose between the two. And I think that just because Kyrie is, when people talk about Kyrie being the quote unquote the most skilled basketball player of all time, and obviously I don't agree with that, because I think that, a guy like Steph Curry, people who have better outcomes typically are more skilled, or at least in terms of how they deploy their skills. But I think when we talk about Kyrie as being the most skilled basketball player of all times, that includes every kind of skill, including off-ball skill, including his ability to shoot off the catch, just like he could shoot off the pull-up, including his ability to kind of cut, and a totally an underrated cutter, his ability to find open space and capitalize on the way that the defense is being bent by another player who is manipulating them, the way that Luka Doncic does. All these kinds of things, the ability to lock in and play defense, and especially in an on-ball one-on-one capacity when he really needs to, and find a way to generate steals and do all kinds of other things. The ability to not turn the ball over when he has the hands and he's in a secondary creation role, knowing when to shoot and when to pass and who to pass to kind of create the hockey assist. Kyrie is good at everything. He's just good at everything. Like, he can do anything, and that's why he's not really sacrificing. He's like the kind of player where I'm like, maybe he's sacrificing a little bit of on-ball responsibilities, but he can make it up from anything else because he's good at everything. And so I think if you have a player like that who is like essentially elite at every skill that goes into the game of basketball, he can play with on the ball and off the ball and be, elite at both.
Yeah, and this is why we could just talk about this forever, because I mean, we started with the Suns, so I think we can close with them. I do think, in theory, Booker and Durant shouldn't be super diminishing to the point where it's far below, the sum of its parts. And so the Phoenix situation just honestly befuddles me, because they've had decent health. They have good role players. And I don't think we're on here saying, oh, Bradley Beal is such an overwhelming negative, he's weighing them down. That's definitely not what we're saying. It could just be some negative variance. We have to be open to that. They could just be a better team than their record says. It's just a really interesting situation. And again, it's one that's prevalent throughout the league, because really, aside from Denver and Boston. Maybe the Knicks with Randall hurt, like but aside from the top two teams, there really aren't too many optimal team builds. And it's just interesting to go through each team and try to figure out. Oh, I guess Milwaukee from a pure profile standpoint, they should be a team that profiles as, a clone theory positive team. But again, you go through the rest of the league, there just really isn't too much optimization. And I'm curious to see when synergy starts to get emphasized more and what direction certain teams go in.
Yep, I totally agree. I will say on the Milwaukee thing, they do kind of profile that way, and they also have been dominant, utterly dominant when the lineup that we think would kind of confer that clone theory benefit, they have been dominant with that lineup. So
I saw somebody tweet, they were like, Milwaukee's the only team that every advanced number will say is dominant, but then you watch them and you're like, no, they're not, and it's so true. Like I watched, plenty of Bucks this season, and they've just never impressed me, honestly. And I'm not saying I'm right. It's clearly a bias on my part. I don't know. I just need to see it more consistently. Maybe it's because Middleton has been in and out of the lineup, haven't gotten the best Middleton. He's clearly an important cog in that machine. But yeah, this was an awesome conversation. I hope people liked it.
For sure. Yeah. Hope people like the conversation. I'm glad we got to kind of unpack this a little bit more in a slightly more structured way, but still kind of moving around and sharing all of our views on this. And, again, if you agree, that would be great. We'd love to hear you kind of build on this in the comments. If you disagree, we'd love to hear why and kind of what parts you don't agree on. And who knows, maybe we'll talk about it on a live stream at some point in the future. But yeah, this was a great conversation, and we will see you on the next episode. This has been Hot Hand Theory.